Russell, this is one that you found. This is a good one, so why don't you take this one away?
Okay, so this is the anatomy of propaganda. This Gaza war, because you do have more dissenters in the newsroom around this than you usually do. A lot of stuff about how the sausage of the media is made is leaking out to an unusual degree. So The Intercept did this piece. Leaked New York Times Gaza memo tells journalists to avoid words genocide, ethnic cleansing, and occupied territory. But Chief, all I'm going to have left is and, or, and that.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, look at that byline there. Go back for a second,
That's
please.
Ryan Grimm and Jeremy Scahill.
Jeremy Scahill. Ryan Grimm on a roll today. Ryan Grimm getting 2 shout-outs on the DueDissidence podcast today. How about that?
I noticed that.
Attaboy, Ryan Grimm on a roll.
Well, now we buttered him up. Maybe we'll get him on next week. And
yeah, I still somehow doubt that. We have to butter him up a lot more. We've got a lot of making up to do. Yeah.
The New York Times instructed journalists covering Israel's war on the Gaza Strip to restrict the use of the terms genocide and ethnic cleansing and to avoid using the phrase occupied territory when describing Palestinian land, according to a copy of an internal memo obtained by The Intercept. The memo also instructs reporters not to use the word Palestine, except in very rare cases, and to steer clear of the term refugee camps to describe areas of Gaza historically settled by displaced Palestinians expelled from other parts of Palestine during previous Israeli-Arab wars. The areas are recognized by the United Nations as refugee camps and house hundreds of thousands of registered refugees. All right, I'm just going to mention here because we're not going to read the whole article, but later on in the article, it is worth checking out in its entirety. They get into the details of this. So what does the Times want instead? The Times wants them described as neighborhoods instead, these refugee camps, even though they are recognized by the United Nations as such. So that's what's really so damning about this, because you're talking about going against the view of what these areas constitute that is the standard view in our international institutions. So at that point, you have no fig leaf over the fact that you're spreading misinformation when you define it as a neighborhood rather than a refugee camp.
Could you call it a
isn't that the kind of
instead of a
misinformation
refugee
we're all
camp?
supposed to be?
Yeah.
What's that?
Could you call it a shtetl instead of a refugee camp? Is that
Could you call it
doable?
a ghetto?
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
Ghetto?
Yeah.
The memo, written by Times Standard editor Susan Wessling, international editor Philip Pan, and their deputies, offers guidance about some terms and other issues we have grappled with since the start of the conflict in October. While the document is presented as an outline for maintaining objective journalistic principles in reporting on the Gaza war, several Times staffers told The Intercept that some of its contents show evidence of the paper's deference to Israeli narratives. Quote, I think it's the kind of thing that looks professional and logical if you have no knowledge of the historical context of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, said a Times newsroom source who requested anonymity for fear of reprisal of the Gaza memo. Quote, but if you do know, it will be clear how apologetic it is to Israel. And to interject, that's what they rely on. They rely on their readers getting their information from the Times so that they won't know better, so that they won't know the historical context. This is why so many people are so ignorant of the nature of this conflict. Yes. This is why, until relatively recently, this conflict had the majority of American support, because they have not been told that these are not neighborhoods, that these are actually refugee camps. Right. They have not been told that the people living in them are mostly descendants of people who were driven off their land in 1948 in the Nakba. They don't know any of this.
Exactly.
And it is because of outlets like the Times that they don't.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't even think of that. Like, yeah, obviously on its face, this distorts your understanding of the current conflict. But, now this was obviously a top-down directive from a memo, which is
Right.
like, hey, there's violence going on. We need to control the narrative, so don't use these words, use these words. That same directive may have not been in place top down over the past 20 years, but certainly those choices inform people's understanding of this going into
Of
a
course.
period of escalated violence
Of
like
course.
this. And that's how you get a situation where people kind of vaguely understand that the Palestinians are being abused, but not really.
Not
And that's
really.
why. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They don't understand the nature of the conflict because they've been misinformed by the newspaper of record and many other establishment media.
Right.
To think it's that was Elon Pape, right, who said the greatest feat of propaganda Israel ever accomplished is convincing people this is complicated.
It's complicated, right.
First distributed to Times journalists in November, the guidance, which collected and expanded on past style directives about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, so yeah, they already had these kinds of things in place, has been regularly updated over the ensuing months. It presents an internal window into the thinking of Times international editors as they have faced upheaval within the newsroom surrounding the paper's Gaza war coverage. Issuing guidance like this to ensure accuracy, consistency, and nuance in how we cover the news is standard practice, said Charlie Statlander, a Times spokesperson. Sounds like he's from the rough side of the tracks, huh? Across all our reporting, including complex events like this, we take care to ensure our language choices are sensitive, current, and clear to our audiences, unquote.
Such bullshit. I mean, so what gaslighting?
Nothing to see here.
Yeah.
Nothing to see here.
Yeah.
Issues over style guidance have been among a bevy of internal rifts at the Times over its Gaza coverage. In January, The Intercept reported on disputes in the Times newsroom over issues with an investigative story on systematic sexual violence on October 7th. The leak gave rise to a highly unusual internal probe. The company faced harsh criticism for allegedly targeting Times workers of Middle East and North African descent, which Times brass denied. See, everyone's standing up for people of color until they become inconvenient. On Monday, executive editor Joe Kahn told staff that the leak investigation has been concluded unsuccessfully. Look at these guys. Nobody talked. Good for you, Spider.
Right.
Don't take any shit from anybody. The Times memo outlines guidance on a range of phrases and terms. Quote, the nature of the conflict has led to inflammatory language and incendiary accusations on all sides. We should be very cautious about using such language, even in quotations. Our goal is to provide clear, accurate information. I'm sorry. And heated language can often obscure rather than clarify the fact, the memo says.
It's almost like they wrote this in anticipation of it being leaked. That's what bullshit it is. Because if this were an internal memo that they trusted were never going to get outside the walls of the New York Times building or the New York Times email addresses of the people who were writing, they'd have just said, hey, just keep in mind, our readership are a bunch of PMC Zionist, liberal readers, and so don't piss them off too much because they might cancel. Like that's clearly what it is.
Yes, yes, but I don't know if it's an anticipation of leaking. This is how they really talk. This is how they really think.
Yeah, no, you're right. This is the code. This is
the code. They're speaking in the code that they always speak,
and they're signaling to each other that they understand the
right.
coded speech. Right.
Right.
And actually, you know what? I take part of that point back because yes, like their bread and butter from a financial standpoint are PMC Zionist libs, basically. But they still do have this stature as the paper of record.
Right.
And there is this feeling throughout the country and to some extent throughout the world that what they say goes. So they have a much broader cultural impact than simply those who pay their bills. Yes. So I take that part back.
Words like slaughter, massacre, and carnage often convey more emotion than information. Now, I don't entirely disagree with this, but you'll see what the next paragraph reveals. think hard before using them in our own voice. Like, I don't think that's a crazy thing for a newspaper to say in and of itself. Just take that sentence in isolation, that a newspaper should be careful with words like slaughter and carnage, because clearly those have connotations, right? It's going into opinion, right? Words like that.
Sure.
So that in and of itself is not crazy, but you'll see where this is going. Can we articulate why we are applying those words to one particular situation and not another? As always, we should focus on clarity and precision. Describe what happened rather than using a label. Okay, well that's if the Times did that, that would be wonderful. That would be wonderful. That would be like journalism or something. But they don't. Despite the memo's framing as an effort to not employ incendiary language to describe killings, quote, on all sides, in the Times reporting on the Gaza war, such language has been used repeatedly to describe attacks against Israelis by Palestinians, and almost never in the case of Israel's large-scale killing of Palestinians.
Yes, because I remember I remember reading the words slaughter and massacre. Like I'm thinking, wait a minute, it's not that I haven't seen this kind of charged language in the Times. It's just I've never heard it applied to when the Palestinians get killed.
No, they are very selective about it, and The Intercept, to their credit, apparently did a study on this. In January, The Intercept published an analysis of New York Times, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times coverage of the war from October 7th through November 24th, a period mostly before the new Times guidance was issued. The Intercept analysis showed that the major newspapers reserved terms like slaughter, massacre, and horrific almost exclusively for Israeli civilians killed by Palestinians, rather than for Palestinian civilians killed in Israeli attacks. The analysis found that, as of November 24th, the New York Times had described Israeli deaths as a massacre on 53 occasions, and those of Palestinians just once. The ratio for the use of slaughter was 22-1, even as the documented number of Palestinians killed climbed to around 15,000. So while the idea that you shouldn't use that language if you want to be just a neutral reporter of facts is a fine idea, one that I agree with, that's not what they actually do. They're telling them not to use it when you're talking about the crimes of Israelis against Palestinians.
Right, exactly. So there's sort of two types of control that they are exercising there. The first was just misrepresenting facts outright. Don't call a refugee camp a refugee camp. Call it a neighborhood. That's just lying, right?
Right.
And then there's a second piece of this where they're like, okay, let's use severe and charged terminology one way, but not the other way, right? They said we shouldn't use it. But they did, as you can see right there. What, 55-1, 22-1, or something like that? Yeah, I mean, and that is consistent with my experience as a reader in the later months of last year, and that was part of what was so maddening, is that they would describe violent attacks against people in both Gaza and the West Bank in very passive language, right? Oh, 16 were killed in an explosion near the hospital, right? Like you wouldn't no idea who did it or why, but they would continually describe
by explosion.
Exactly. But then they would say this was in response to the horrific massacre that took place on October 7th. And if you're going to use that rhetoric one way, you have to use it both ways, or don't use it at all. Like I said, I'd be fine with them just saying, hey, we're going to steer clear of those words because that can be emotionally manipulative to the reader. But it is emotionally manipulative to the reader, and more when you only apply it in one direction.
Yeah, of course. And it also later on in the article gets into how it tells them, don't use why they're not supposed to use the term genocide. Genocide has a very specific legal meaning, and it should only be used in that context. Okay, well, what they are doing, you could argue, fits the legal definition of genocide. Now, if you want to say objective reporting should say this many people were killed and this is happening on the ground, and many international observers consider these acts of genocide, I think that's fair,
Right.
rather than to call it by definition genocide. But that's not what they're saying. They're saying not to even get into that.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. And that's just another example of how not only a specific narrative gets sort of crafted in real time, but how the entire understanding of an issue can be molded over the course of several
Right.
decades, right?
Sure.
Because as you
Sure.
mentioned earlier, like, why were people so, I won't even say necessary. I mean, yes, they were misinformed, but more than misinformed, they were just kind of uninformed because the rhetoric
Right.
around this was just so vague, right? Like we didn't really get, like when Norm Finkelstein came out and really described Gaza as an open air concentration camp and really described point for point why that is not a hyperbolic thing to say. That brought the issue into focus for so many people in a way that years of reading about it in the news never did, because you don't actually get precise language or even correct language from even an outlet like the New York Times. And now we know that that's for a reason.
Well, and this, Israel is really bringing this to light because the other things they misinform people, most of their newsroom are on the same page. This is only coming out now because what I wrote right after October 7th about how these people have been fed a lot of, anti-racist social justice ideas and the cognitive dissonance of telling them to support what is clearly a classic settler colonialist project where brown people are being mad. It's just too much cognitive dissonance for a lot of them. But Trump is evil. He's a greater evil than Biden. He's a fascist. They all swallow that. And
Right.
and that kind of reporting is just as distorted. You just don't have to lean on them to stay inside those lines. They're already inside those lines. And as Taibbi has
Right.
pointed out, a lot of his reporting, it's not that you don't get people who get hired at these places that are not inside that consensus, but they're pushed out very quickly.
Please clap.